For quite some time now, I've really wanted to talk about cancelled manga within Weekly Shonen Jump, as there is an abundance of different series that come into the scene very quickly and just as quickly leave it. Even some that are highly anticipated or well received don't necessarily get the time of day for as long as people would like. So there is 3 series that I plan to talk about today, Time Paradox Ghostwriter, Zipman, and Bone Collection. 2 of these, Time Paradox and Zipman, were actually rather well received, at least on Twitter, but it seems like the community or the sales behind it was not up to par. The manga industry is very grueling, not only health-wise, but competition-wise. If the series seems like it's not going to get much of an interest, or if it's not selling as much, or people aren't voting for it, it's going to be cancelled rather quickly. Any of these series could turn themselves around or with time be able to spread their wings a little bit further to indulge into different concepts and ideas, as 15 chapters is really not much to go off. But this is how the industry works, unfortunately, and the rinse and repeat cycle makes sure that these series don't get that much of a time to shine, and then a new author, a new series, a new name will come into the scene to replace them. Before I start talking about these 3 series, I want to preface this whole video by saying a handful of things. First and foremost, if you enjoyed this series, that's perfectly alright. My opinion or my understanding for these series shouldn't devalue your own experience. I may not like them, I may not enjoy them, and I may just be expressing my opinion towards them, but don't think that I'm trying to nullify or negate how you feel towards that series. I feel sometimes I have to reiterate this if I'm talking negatively about a series, at least in some sort of critiquing or analytical fashion, whatever fancy word you want to put over the top of it, just so people understand that I'm not trying to hate the series for the sake of it. I have respect for all of these series, and with time I feel some of them could easily evolve and change and really create something that people would wholeheartedly enjoy. Unfortunately, just with industry standards and how they actually handle things, it's very difficult to do. And if you aren't a hit or a success from the first 15 chapters, it's not looking all too bright. Secondly, I'm going to try and avoid the final handful of chapters within the series, as getting the notification that your series is going to be cancelled, a lot of things start to get rushed and pushed along quickly and left out, and final reading experience is usually pretty bad. It's very difficult to kind of be within the building blocks of your narrative to only realize that you have to end it in 3 to 4 chapters. Of course, things are going to be left out and completely all over the place and in disarray, so I'll do my best to leave them out of consideration. And lastly, if you end up enjoying this video, consider subscribing. I greatly appreciate it. The first series that I want to start off with is Time Paradox Ghostwriter, and this had quite a interesting lifespan on Twitter. I've seen a lot of people talking about it, a lot of people hyping it up and really enjoying it. Hell, even I read the first chapter for it. While I thought the first chapter was alright, read the second chapter and decided it wasn't really for me. I didn't really find anything all too bad about it, just more so that I've read something identical to this before, and this is kind of the first biggest issue, if you want to call it an issue, when it comes to manga creation stories. They are competing with, 1, not only the biggest manga creation story, and 2, some of the biggest author and artists within the industry. Bakuman is a very impressive and reputable series. It's quite old now, actually, and it's done by 2 very iconic people, the author and artist for Death Note. So when you're creating a manga that is centered around manga creation, in the back of your mind, you're somewhat competing with this series, even though it's said years old. You're not directly competing with it, but people are going to eventually make that comparison. So how do you put a twist on manga creation? This is what Time Paradox Ghostwriter does. It brings in a twist, some sort of element that is unique to the manga creation aspect or genre, if you want to call it that, allows it to thrive in a different light, from a different perspective. However, thriving is not necessarily the words I would use to frame the story. If I were to frame Time Paradox Ghostwriter, it would be along the lines of a somewhat interesting plot that is poorly conceived. Straight away, this series only had 14 chapters, but the reception for it was actually pretty high than anything else that I'm going to talk about. There was a lot of anticipation for this series to do well. It was getting pushed around within other series because of its element or concept that it was somewhat playing on, which is the whole alternate timeline type situation where the main character is getting a version of Weekly Shonen Jump 10 years into the future from a different timeline, jumping into his timeline. There's a lot of things you can do with that from other series within Weekly Shonen Jump, and that's somewhat what they were kind of doing. Basically, a lot of references were being made. So there was a lot of anticipation for this series. My opening experience for reading this story wasn't all too great. I didn't necessarily hate it. I just found nothing necessarily appealing about it. But the first biggest thing that comes in when I started to reread it to make this video is plagiarism. And this is the biggest problem that this series has. Not only plagiarism in itself, but the way the main character perceives plagiarism, not only from an outside perspective, but also his own perspective. Plagiarism is obviously an extremely serious thing, especially within the manga industry. So writing about it isn't necessarily taboo. It's not necessarily a cancelled topic, but it's very difficult to do and should be done with a lot of respect and a very good showcase and understanding of how bad plagiarism truly is. This story does not do that. There's nothing about Time Paradox Ghostwriter that paints plagiarism in a poor light. If anything, it tries to morally conflict you to make you agree with the concept of plagiarism. That in itself is a problem. They do this pretty easily by having the main character be extremely fickle, very back and forth, not really understanding what he wants to do, but for some reason has very weird situations where he's very confident and forthcoming with what he wants to do. So not only is his character fickle in terms of its design and his architecture, but his emotions, his response, and even his understanding of plagiarism itself is extremely fickle, thus making our viewpoint on plagiarism extremely fickle. This is a very big problem. They attach this moral conflict of either plagiarizing or letting someone die. So to put simply, the main character has to plagiarize a story so he can save someone else's life that he doesn't really know or hardly knows. You can see the moral confliction there, right? Of course, you would plagiarize a story if it meant to save someone's life. Unfortunately, and I guess somewhat even fortunately for readers, we aren't in that position. So on the unfortunate side, we can't actually wholeheartedly agree with his decision making. Yes, you would probably easily take that position yourself, but when you're reading this story, you don't want to actively neglect and minimalize plagiarism and the seriousness surrounding it. This is what this story does. The way it was handled, at least at the beginning of the story, was not well approached and, like I said at the beginning, very poorly conceived. It's an interesting idea, just not tackled with what I think is the right mindset or the right approach. The whole foundation of the story is the main character is plagiarizing a story and claiming it to be his own, even going to the point of tracing the artwork from future copies of Weekly Shonen Jump, and he's publishing it as his own story. What's stopping him is literally nothing. He's too scared, is pretty much the simple terms for it. He doesn't want to cause a bigger issue than he already has. So it's very hard to get behind the main character when he's actively doing everything in his favor not to stop the success of his series, even though it's completely plagiarized and not his at all. No real backbone, to be honest. Then you add in that element of, well, he's plagiarizing to save someone else's life, and by that point, you don't really care. I know a lot of people may not even care about the plagiarism side of things, but this is probably the biggest flaw of the story and probably the biggest reason why it didn't actually take off the way it did. I'd imagine if it was recontextualized and maybe even approached from a different angle, maybe even not the biggest driving force for the story itself, there may have been something of potential here because the artwork is beautiful. It's really enjoyable to look at. There's some very incredible panels within here. I thought the artwork accompanied it really well. It gave me a heavy Bakuman vibe, and if you're a fan of Bakuman, you probably would have liked this series if it went about it a different way without the plagiarism, or at least change that concept at its core. On top of the idea of the story itself, I just genuinely did not like any characters within this story. I thought the main character was, once again, completely fickle, unreliable, no backbone, and honestly, just a very unreliable individual. unbelievable. The amount of times he goes back and forth between trying to understand his own situation, to then somewhat doing his absolute best to justify it, to then not agreeing with it, to then justifying it again, just all of these roundabout emotions that just run you tired, and it kind of makes you just want to sit down and be like, look, unappealing for a main character to do. Because he's doing everything within these moments to justify his own success and plagiarism when it's not even his story. He's relying on it. To me, I just generally did not like the main character, as well as the side characters, if you could even say there was any, not really any better. If anything, kind of similar to the main character being all over the place personality-wise, or very one trick, which is one emotion or one personality and that's it. But then again, at least in that aspect, I give it somewhat the benefit of the doubt because of the length of the story. 14 chapters is very small. It's hard to get connected to these characters in that time frame, so maybe with time, I could have come to enjoy the main character and maybe even appreciate the side characters a little bit more. So overall, the experience was just somewhat odd. Dealing with such a full frontal issue like plagiarism in an industry that suffers with plagiarism, you're playing a very tiptoey type of game, and you want to play it extremely intelligently and professionally to make for the best results. To me, this just seems poorly conceived, and I say that with respect because the artwork is gorgeous, and I hope that the person creating this story and potentially doing the art come back and show Weekly Shonen Jump and the readers what they can actually do, with hopefully a more grounded take on a story. The next series is one that had a bit of a legacy, it's probably the wrong word to use, but a bit of a popularity behind it already because of the author being the assistant to Horikoshi. There was a lot of My Hero influence surrounding it, and this series was known as Zipman. So Zipman has 17 chapters, and for me, it seems heavily inspired by My Hero Academia. It's taken a lot of roots from it, a lot of themes even, but it obviously tries its best to carve out its own path. I personally really enjoy the artwork. I thought there was a lot of attention to detail, the lines were super crisp and just very beautiful and aesthetically pleasing to look at. The action was massive and cinematography-esque. Basically, when the moments got big, it was visualized and captured extremely well. It was very enthralling. So it had a very good approach and eye for details and aesthetic, action, pretty much everything for a battle shonen to thrive within Weekly Shonen Jump. However, it seemed like the story itself just didn't really stick. I think it definitely had the potential to stick. Given more time, it definitely could have fleshed itself out, as it seems like there was a lot of things that wanted to be pushed on early, but because of probably the feedback they were getting, they decided to somewhat brace for the worst rather early on. And I'm talking around about chapter 6, chapter 7, which, considering this has 17 chapters, you would expect to get some sort of news on cancellation around 13 to 14 chapters. So for the most part, they actually managed to fit a mini final arc within this, which was actually extremely impressive. I didn't really know how they managed to do that just in terms of jumping things around, but it wouldn't necessarily be correct to say it was cohesive, but they made it work as best they could, and I give them props for that. They have my respect. I personally wasn't a fan of the story. I didn't really vibe with the whole robot suit idea. It reminded me heavily of Pacific Rim, even though I haven't even seen that movie, but I understand the concept of Pacific Rim. It was treated more so like suits with zippers and extraordinary powers. It's somewhat of a weird blend of Pacific Rim and Power Rangers with the whole Megazoids or whatever they're called. So with that inspiration and Japan's love of Gundam, I think this is what Zipman was going for, trying to channel that aesthetic framing of Gundam or Power Rangers within its robot, within its action and its whole approach to fighting combat, but somewhat missed the mark in terms of telling a compelling story with compelling characters. I've never been a big fan of having kind of one-trick characters or one note, one personality, one emotion type characters within a story, only because they usually split it up with another character that's either just just as important, that has the opposing emotion, personality, response, whatever it may be. So both of them being separate, they're more so just like a singular thing, but when you combine them, they're like an actual normal functioning human. I liked the dynamic between the two brothers, which is the main characters, but I genuinely disliked the personalities they harbored, because one of them was the over-the-top, aggressive, super strong, sporty, but very dumb and emotionally distorted, didn't really understand how people felt, tried his best however, and you couldn't help but feel somewhat sorry for him because people viewed him as this monster or devil because of how he upheld himself, but deep down he's truly nice, very cliche. That was his main fragrance. His brother, on the other hand, was the complete opposite, super intelligent, rather cold, but could read people extremely well, very hands-on, but didn't really have the same characteristics or energy compared to his brother. So when you combine those two, they create like this remarkable human being that thrives within the world. Whereas when you separate them, one's extremely successful and the other is neglected and hardly has any friends because of his over-the-top personality. Like I said, I enjoyed the dynamic between the two and how they interacted with one another. But the personalities themselves, very over-the-top, very one-note, and somewhat even cliche. Not in a bad sort of cliche type of way, but just stuff that you've already seen before. I feel Zipman was very close to being something that a lot of people could have enjoyed, and a lot of people did actually enjoy it, but in terms of it being successful, not so much. It had the artwork, it had somewhat interesting characters, the premise was almost there where it could tap into Japan's love for Gundam, robots, mecha, all that great stuff, but unfortunately just couldn't hit all the right notes. In a sense, it's very simplistic. And I think that's the biggest problem with it, is that it tries to do all of these things, but it's biting off a bit more it can actually handle. So you end up having these very odd situations with these characters where they go back on their own word extremely quickly, or they're very unlikable, even though they're meant to be extremely likable. Just the way they're very stubborn in what they think and how they approach things. It's like it's trying to test you on seeing how much you can hate these characters when in reality they're built up so they can be likable. Why even do that? Why bother? I am hoping that this author, being as they are a rookie, I believe, comes back into the industry and thrives, because the artwork is extremely impressive, and seeing this person come back with a rethought out story with that incredible artwork could be a very massive hitter for Weekly Shonen Jump. So hopefully they see that, they harness it, and they come back stronger and better than ever. Now, the last series that I want to talk about is one that just did not click with me in any aspect whatsoever, and that is known as Bone Collection. Now, talking about this series may actually be pretty quick, because Bone Collection just was not for me. Opening impressions, I feel like it was trying to capitalize on the success of Demon Slayer, but also the success surrounding the recent interest in curses and spirits and anything relating to supernatural. So the series itself revolves around yokai and shaman-esque people exercising those yokai, and as you can already tell, very somewhat simple. Very cliche, nothing crazy or over the top. I think a series like this has been done every single year to some degree within Weekly Shonen Jump, right? So what would make this series unique? Honestly, not all too much. The fact that the main character comes in contact with one of, if not the most powerful yokai, and the only ability he has, other than being a really poor shaman himself, is that he can use the abilities of the yokai. And while that is a somewhat minuscule, interesting concept, the way it's utilized is very bare bones and uninspired. He's just weaponizing yokai, and for some reason it's forbidden because of this rumor that's going around, and without this ability, really not a shaman at all. He's probably one of the worst shamans. I personally found it boring. It's not necessarily anything really new. It's somewhat of a weird blend of a lot of different series, somewhat slightly trying to capitalize off that success. Not in a very obnoxious type of way like some series type to do, but this one just felt like it was trying to do a lot of different things where it just felt completely out of its comfort zone or completely flat, just didn't really know what to do. The biggest thing is that the characters were just unlikable. There was really nothing about any of the characters that you could necessarily like, and once again I try and give this a bit of slack just because it's only 15 chapters that it had, but even early on there's usually some sort of emotional connection or likability to some of these characters to some small fashion, but to be honest there's not really much there. Either the characters are very unlikable or you've seen this archetype of a character done way too many times before and it's kind of just repetitive. However, once again I give this a bit of slack just because of the time that it had, and with more of it, potentially that could change. For me, the biggest thing that was missing is that there was nothing to hook readers in. I didn't really get any sense of urgency towards something that should be special or something that should be unique to hook the reader in. It felt like I was just reading it for the sake of it, just to see how these characters were going to unfold or how this event would unfold, but there was nothing really there to kind of compel you to continue forward, because the characters weren't doing it. The abilities wasn't necessarily doing it. The approach to different yokai or spirits wasn't really doing it. There wasn't much here to really begin with, and I try and say that with the most respect. I feel like I'm blindly hating it a little bit too much, so I want to boil it down to me just genuinely not enjoying what it was trying to do. I appreciate its artwork, as simplistic as it was. It had some very interesting flair to it here and there, but I'm always interested to see how this author potentially comes back within the industry, tries to do something a little bit out of their comfort zone, or something maybe they do feel comfortable with, but isn't trying to capitalize off the spirit yokai situation that a lot of other series are trying to do now, because it's very successful. So I guess only time will tell. To bring this video to a conclusion, I like to say that out of these three series, Time Paradox Ghostwriter, Zipman, and Bone Collection, I think the one I enjoyed the most was definitely Zipman. As kind of weird as it was for me, and probably wouldn't be a series that I read week by week or maybe even in total, I feel it had the most potential to be something even great. There is an abundance of cancelled series within Weekly Shonen Jump, and so far these three are from 2020 alone. I plan to go backwards somewhat in order, but if you do have a 3-series lineup of cancelled manga from Weekly Shonen Jump that you would like for me to talk about, please let me know. Also, let me know how you felt about these 3 series. Did you enjoy them? Did you dislike them? Were you crushed when they got cancelled, or were you hoping to see them thrive and flourish into a big bright future? I'd love to hear your thoughts. But I want to thank you all for watching. Hope you enjoyed. Drink plenty of water, and I will see you in the next one. Goodbye.